Hello and welcome that you all came. You may remember I'm Dorothea Arnold from the Department of Egyptian Art, introducing the whole series at the moment, the whole afternoon, and then our first speaker. Now, I looked a little bit with the help of my colleagues from the Ancient Near East Department, and the first of the Wilkinson lectures was in 1987. So we are at number 23 at the moment. And it was Philippe de Montebello who introduced the first inaugural lecture on January 14th, 1987. And as usual, he gave some good introductory words, from which I'm going to read you a few. For instance, he says, the lecture series, which combines, this is my remark now, which combines, of course, the three departments, Department of Egyptian Art, Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art, and Department of Islamic Art, in one afternoon. And he said, Philippe de Montebello, the lecture series is unprecedented in the sense that it has been made possible financially by more than 100 friends of Charles Wilkinson. Support that comes from all parts of the world. The extent of this support is quite clearly a measure of the man, and it is. Charles Wilkinson, he said later on, set a number of records. Not the least of these is that he was associated with this institution for 66 years, which means that he worked under 6 of the 8 directors of the museum. In the meantime, we can say 6 of the 9 directors. In 1920, he joined the graphic section of the Metropolitan's Egyptian expedition. And he was, as you know, he did quite a number of the beautiful facsimiles that we are showing outside of this hall. Wilkinson was then active in Iran, at Kasri-e-Abu Nasr, and at Nishapur in the 1930s and 40s. He was involved with the British School of Archaeology in Iraq with Sir Max Mallowan at Nimrud in the 1950s and 60s, and of course a site that yielded many of the objects in the museum's collection of the ancient Near East. Wilkinson, was also instrumental in bringing about the collaboration of the Metropolitan Museum with the University of Pennsylvania in excavations at Hassanlu and with the Oriental Institute in Chicago at Nippur in Iraq. Marvelous times when all these excavations were going on. In 1956, Charles became curator of ancient Near Eastern art here in this museum, and later when the department was merged with that of Islamic art in 1959, he became the head of the joint departments. Since 1963, he was curator emeritus of the museum. And of course, as you all know, he died in 1986. So quite a man to remember. Today, we have chosen a theme that we called Rulers in Times of Transition. We didn't know anything when we came down with this. It just happened. And the first one is, of course, Professor Jacobus van Dijk, Associate Professor of Egyptology in the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And Professor van Dijk is an old friend of our department and of the museum. And so we are especially grateful that he came to give us this lecture about his newest views on this important figure, Haremhab. Professor van Dijk was, from 1981 through 2003, the epigraphic philologist of the joint expedition of the Egypt Exploration Society London and the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden to that part of Saqqara, which you all know, that contains the tomb of Haremhab before he became king, and then more tombs were found in that area, for instance, the treasurer Maya of Tutankhamun and other tombs in the area. It was directed by Professor Geoffrey Martin and also of the curators of the Leiden Museum, Hans Schneider and Martin Raven. In 1986, he became involved with the Brooklyn Museum, and he is going since then to the precinct of the goddess Mut at Karnak with them, now also with the Professor Bryan from the Johns Hopkins, who is just transferring her students back to the United States. In 2006 and 2007, he joined Geoffrey Martin for the Cambridge expedition in the Valley of the Kings to re-excavate the royal tomb of Haremhab, and that's where many of the new finds were made. There are many books to his name. One, which is really a standard, is The New Kingdom Necropolis of Memphis. That's that Saqqara part, Historical and Iconographical Studies of 1993. So without more ado, please welcome Professor Jacobus van Dijk, who is going to speak about Haremhab, General, Prince, Regent, King.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure to be able to speak here today in this marvelous museum in this great city. And as we've already heard, the subject of my talk is the General Haremhab, who subsequently became King of Egypt. Haremhab played a crucial role in one of the most important periods of transition in Egyptian history, the end of the 18th dynasty, around the end of the 14th century BC. It was a very difficult period in Egyptian history shortly after the upheaval caused by Akhenaten's religious reform, a revolution one might call it, and the reign of the boy king Tutankhamun, and also, of course, the events following the sudden death of Tutankhamun, who died very young, as we all know. During this period, Haremhab rose from the ranks of general to become chief or commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army. And then during the reign of Tutankhamun, he became regent of Egypt, a kind of viceroy, the deputy of the king. Tutankhamun himself was very young when he ascended the throne, probably about 6 years or something like that. And of course, at that tender age, he was unable to rule the world empire that Egypt was at the time. So he needed someone to hold his hand, as it were, and that was Haremhab. We know very little about the origin of this man. His family background is largely unknown to us. It is often speculated that he came from a place called Hud Nesu up in the northern part of Middle Egypt. Kom al-Ahmar, it's called nowadays. But we don't know anything about the further background of this man. That Hud Nesu played an important role in this period, we don't know either, although it is suggested by a couple of seals that have been found in the palace of Malkata of Amenhotep III, the grandfather of Tutankhamun, which mention Hud Nesu. So it must have had some importance in those days. The date of Haremhab's birth is also unknown. We have no idea how old he was when he actually became a powerful figure. But it is quite clear that he must have risen through the ranks of the army under Akhenaten. Of course, here he is, the great Akhenaten. And perhaps even earlier, because it must have taken several years for him to rise to the ranks of general and commander-in-chief. Here he is. This is one of the few monuments we have of Haremhab before he became king. This is one of three scribe statues that we have of Haremhab, and the museum here in New York is very lucky to have the best. The other two are very much more damaged, as we shall see in a moment. This wonderful statue shows Haremhab in the position of a scribe. The scribe is the intellectual of ancient Egypt. Anybody wanting a career had to become a scribe first. And the statue is inscribed with wonderful inscriptions, both on the base and on the scroll that the scribe is actually holding on his knees. And this text is particularly interesting because here he depicts himself as a person who embodies the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, the god of good government, and also the god who was the deputy of the sun god Re on earth. And in this role, Haremhab sees himself as well as the deputy of the king, who is the embodiment of the sun god. So this is something we are going to come back to later. The king is anonymous in the inscription on the statue. He's not mentioned by name, but it is quite clear that it must have been Tutankhamun. And here are the two, or rather one of the two remaining statues. This one has recently surfaced. It's in a magazine in Karnak and has recently been published. As you can see, it's very much more damaged than the one in this museum, and this one is even more damaged in the Cairo Museum. Interesting inscriptions also on the scrolls and on the base, and this one, very, very damaged in the Cairo Museum, actually has the cartouche of Tutankhamun in several places. So there can be no doubt that these statues date from the time that Tutankhamun was on the throne of Egypt. There's also this wonderful statue in Sydney, which looks very much like the statue here in the Met, and it has been suggested, probably on good grounds, I should think, that this is also Haremhab, although there is no way we can prove it because there are no inscriptions left on the statue. Then there is a small doorway in the Louvre in Paris. Very small. It must have come from a kind of a small votive chapel, perhaps in the necropolis of Abydos. We don't know for sure. But it doesn't come from what is the most important monument dating back to the time before Haremhab became king, and that is his magnificent tomb in the Memphite necropolis, the necropolis of Memphis at Saqqara. Here we have a door jamb from the tomb, which also shows his major titles. Here, for example, this short title is the title of hereditary prince, crown prince to all intents and purposes. This title is often found in the string of titles that is held by several high officials, but it's usually part of a sort of standard phraseology, which doesn't actually have all that much meaning. But here it stands on its own, and in that case, it definitely means crown prince, hereditary prince, heir presumptive, someone who was actually going to become king if the reigning king would die without issue. Then there is the title overseer, great overseer of the army, commander-in-chief of the army of Egypt, and then we have, of course, his name, Haremhab. Haremhab is the conventional way we pronounce the name nowadays, Haremhab or Haremhab. But recently, Babylonian sources have been reconstructed from broken tablets in which this Haremhab appears. And from those tablets, we can now say that the Egyptians probably pronounced his name something like Harmaha, which is to us is a bit surprising maybe, but we'll stick to Haremhab. The monuments we have seen so far have inscriptions which identify Haremhab with all his titles, but there is also a famous anonymous representation of Haremhab, which is this block in the museum in Berlin. It comes from the Memphite necropolis, and it shows in the lower register a funeral cortege. You can just see the sarcophagus here, which is being dragged to the tomb, and the priests mourning and wailing. And then you have a group of high officials, each identified by their title, including here, for example, the two viziers of Egypt. At the head of the viziers, even taking precedence over the viziers, is this figure, and that figure is identified with the titles you'll now recognize: hereditary prince and overseer of the army. So even though his name is not there, this must have been Haremhab. But as I've already said earlier, the most important monument we have from the pre-royal career of Haremhab is his magnificent Memphite tomb, a big tomb in the necropolis of Memphis, the capital city of ancient Egypt, and located at the modern village of Saqqara. And we can see here this magnificent tomb. It's the biggest tomb in the whole of the necropolis as far as we can see now, looking very much like an Egyptian temple with pylons, an open forecourt, a second pylon, columned halls, several chapels, another columned hall, and then at the very end the chapels for the funerary cult of Haremhab. And then, of course, the tomb itself is deep down underground, about 30 meters deep, which can be reached through a shaft located in the inner courtyard of the tomb. Here is a picture taken in the late 1970s when the tomb was excavated, and this is now only part of the tomb because we now know that there was a big forecourt in front of the pylon as well, which has only recently been excavated. It's a huge monument. I think it's about 55 meters in length. The tomb is justly famous for its magnificent reliefs, but many statues, or rather statue fragments, were found as well in the tomb. Now, I can't dwell on all those statues this afternoon, but one example I want to single out for a specific reason, and that is this magnificent statue of Haremhab and his first wife, the wife he had before he became king. She must have died before he actually ascended the throne. And this statue was deposited in one of the magazines of the expedition, which unfortunately, during our absence, during one summer, was broken into by thieves. And they rigorously cut out the figure of the wife. So we are still waiting for this torso to appear on the antiquities market. So please keep an eye out. It's now displayed in its incomplete form in the Luxor Museum, where you can all see it. But as I said, the tomb is first and foremost famous for its reliefs, some of which are the standard reliefs that you find in any Egyptian tomb, albeit of a superb quality, religious scenes showing Haremhab worshipping various gods, like this one where he is worshipping the sun god Re-Harachti. But more important, perhaps, are the historical reliefs. And I can show you only a selection of those. First, I want to show you the reliefs on this particular wall in the inner courtyard of the tomb. This section of the courtyard, of the inner courtyard, is related to the career of Haremhab as a military leader and regent, deputy king of Egypt. This is an excavation photograph showing this wall. It's very incomplete, unfortunately. And that is particularly unfortunate because in the upper register, which is completely lacking, here, there would have been lots of inscription inscriptions identifying the various persons involved, and also the peoples perhaps that are depicted here. Horemheb is shown here as the great victor, the great general who conquered lots of peoples surrounding Egypt, in the south, in the east, and to the west of Egypt. And they are all lined up here as people who have been conquered by Horemheb and who are subsequently going to be presented to the king of Egypt, Tutankhamun. Like these people here at the beginning, those are people from the east, Babylonians perhaps, or Palestinians, we don't know, Philistines, whatever you want to call them. And these people are Libyans from the western desert to the west of Egypt. All these people are depicted in their, well, let's call it national costume, here with, with these peculiar side locks and earrings. And various other people here, for example, at the beginning, peoples from the south, from Nubia, the southern part of Egypt and the present Sudan. Very expressive faces. Unlike the Egyptians are more stereotype in these reliefs, but the foreign peoples have been given very individual faces, very expressive. These prisoners of war are presented, each of them individually, to Horemheb. Egyptian soldiers bring them forward, of course giving them a good talking to first, push and actually punching them under the chin sometimes. As an intermediary, there is a group of 4 high officers of the Egyptian army, immediate subordinates of Horemheb himself, here in full state dress, leaning on their staffs and obviously presenting the prisoners to Horemheb. Often people tend to think that these are actually women, but those are the long wigs that were in fashion in those days for high officials. And then we have a soldier bringing one of the prisoners of war to Horemheb himself, who is here depicted on a very much larger scale than anybody else in the reliefs, and is unfortunately incomplete. But luckily we have the block that belongs here, which is in a private collection somewhere in Egypt. At least it was in the 1970s. We have no idea where it is at the moment. And this is a block of crucial importance because it not only shows Horemheb himself, but also the inscriptions identifying him and telling us something about how he wanted himself to be seen. And one of the phrases used in the inscription here is that he was widely renowned in the land of the Hittites. So he is obviously figuring himself as the great commander-in-chief who is feared by all the people surrounding Egypt, all Egypt's enemies. Then, of course, the inevitable scribes. In Egypt, everything was meticulously registered. So we have a group of 6 scribes who enter the names, nationalities, and details about their health and their age, etc., on papyrus. The scrolls on their laps, just like the scribe statue of Horemheb. And then they are, again, there's of course a scribe here checking that everything has been registered correctly by his colleagues, and then they are sat down in a group on the ground. And these scenes, I was immediately reminded of these scenes in Horemheb when I saw on television in 1991. After the first Gulf War, you saw these Iraqi soldiers who had surrendered and were sitting on the ground in the desert, just like these ancient Egyptian prisoners of war. Again, very expressive faces, real masterpieces of Egyptian sculpture. And Egyptian soldiers with the horses of the great generals and of Haremhab himself. And then on the adjacent wall, the story continues. There Haremhab is presenting the foreign prisoners of war to Tutankhamun himself, and in exchange is rewarded by the king with the gold of honor, the highest state order of ancient Egypt. Perhaps not very clear, but this is just to show you the context of the scene. Here we not only see soldiers, but also their family, women and children. Children on the shoulders and in slings around the back of the women. And the men with their hands in wooden manacles. Again, beautifully expressive faces with all these nasal furrows, and there's Haremhab himself with receiving the gold of honor in front of the king and queen. Unfortunately, only the lower bit of the representation of king and queen have survived, but we were very lucky to find a relief fragment, which you can see here, which preserves the lower ends of the cartouches of the king involved. And from these it is crystal clear that this is indeed Haremhab, Tutankhamun and his wife Ankhes and Amun, one of the daughters of Akhenaten. The cartouches have later been altered and then read Haremhab. So we see here something that is very strange for us, maybe, but that Haremhab is receiving the gold of honor from his own royal person, Haremhab, as king. But originally it was Tutankhamun, there is no doubt about that. It has been suggested in the past that this part of the tomb was actually decorated and built during the Amarna period, during Akhenaten's reign. But this is clearly not the case, as the texts clearly identify king and queen, as I said, as Tutankhamun and his wife. There is Haremhab being rewarded with the gold of honor. And as you see, a uraeus, a cobra, has been added to his brow. This cobra is the royal symbol par excellence. And it's only royal figures and gods and goddesses who are shown with this uraeus, this cobra. It was clearly added at a later stage. It was not part of the original decoration, but it must have been added once Haremhab had become king. We can see that in several places in the tomb, that this uraeus has been added. Here, for example, it's very shallow relief, clearly a later addition. And here too, where it's sort of cutting into the inscription almost, clearly something done as an afterthought, once Haremhab had become king. And it's now clear also from the underground, from the substructure of the tomb, that this too was transformed into a royal complex. The original tomb ended somewhere here, and all this extension was added later to turn it into a kind of royal tomb. If you compare it to the later royal tomb of Haremhab, of which we shall see pictures later on, you can see that the sequence of rooms is much the same as in the Memphite private tomb of Haremhab. So it looks like Haremhab was actually intending to use his Memphite tomb even after he had become king. And later, at a later stage in his reign, he changed his mind and started constructing a proper royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings in Thebes. But originally he intended this to be his royal tomb as well, which would have been a major departure from the tradition in ancient Egypt. Well, then At some stage, in his 10th year, Tutankhamun suddenly dies. And because Horemheb was destined to succeed him, because he was crown prince and heir presumptive, it would have been logical if he had succeeded Horemheb straight away. But this didn't actually happen. Instead, a king called Ai mounted the throne, a high official dating back to the time of Akhenaten himself, probably related to Akhenaten's mother, Queen Ti. How this all happened is still a mystery. We don't know exactly what went on at court, why Ai was able to take the throne and not Horemheb. We have no idea. It has been suggested that he only acted as a kind of interim king, and it has also been suggested that Horemheb, even though he wanted to become king, he was unable to because he was on the battlefield in Syria fighting the Hittites. We know from other sources that Egypt was at war with the Hittites at the time, and Horemheb, as the great commander of the Egyptian armed forces, may well have been on the battlefield far away from Egypt and unable to reach Egypt in time for the burial of Tutankhamun and to take the throne of Egypt. But after about 4 years, when Ai, who was already very old when he mounted the throne, when Ai died, then Horemheb becomes king. And the first monument we have from his days as king is this statue group in the museum in Turin. Unfortunately, it's incomplete, but it has a most interesting text on the back of the statue. In the museum, this statue is placed right up against the wall, so you can't photograph the text. And what you see here is a composite photograph of the various parts of the text, but here's a drawing of it. And in this long text, the coronation text of Horemheb, as it is known, Horemheb describes the path that led to the throne for him. Usually, Egyptian kings tell that their mother received the royal child, the future king, from the god Amun. So there's a myth of the divine birth of the pharaoh. But Horemheb doesn't resort to this myth. He couldn't, of course, because he was not of royal blood himself. He tells here that his local god, Horus of Hutnezu, actually elected him to become king of Egypt. And that the king, the ruling king, at his, when he was a private individual, rejoiced at the choice of the god and decided to make him deputy king of Egypt and crown prince. So Horus of Hutnezu had destined him for the kingship. The king appointed him as supreme chief of the land and hereditary prince of this entire land, as the text says. And then he governed the two lands as the king's deputy and was given the title eldest son of Horus. And Horus, of course, is the ruling king, so eldest son of Horus is a ceremonial religious title identifying the crown prince. And then eventually the text goes on, of course, telling us about the actual coronation of Horemheb. Here, by the way, is the name of Horemheb already written in a royal cartouche, but still in its pre-royal form with the title Crown Prince and Overseer of the two lands being Upper and Lower Egypt. But further down, once he's become king, he gets his proper cartouches, Horemheb, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt and the son of Re, and all the usual titles that are associated with the Egyptian kingship. His actual rule appears to have been rather uneventful and peaceful, although the war with the Hittites was still going on. He was obviously no longer involved with it himself, at least not physically on the battlefield. And he then embarked on a major building program in Egypt, erected many beautiful statues, like this one, again in the museum in Turin, with the god Amun. And these statues, which have surfaced from the cachette in Luxor in the 1980s, and many more. Also, he erected a huge stela in Karnak, the so-called Edict of Horemheb, in which he enumerates a great many reforms in the government of Egypt, legal measures mainly, to stamp out abuses such as the unlawful requisitioning of boats and slaves and the theft of cattle hides, the illegal taxation of private farmland, fraud in assessing lawful taxes, the extortion of local mayors, and also there are paragraphs dealing with the regulation of the local courts of justice, the personnel of the royal harem and other state employees, and the protocol at court. So it's a legal document, one of the most important legal documents we have from ancient Egypt, and it's often seen in the light of the perceived chaos that broke out in Egypt during the reign of Akhenaten and the boy king Tutankhamun. This is all royal propaganda, of course. Then, in about his 7th year, he suddenly must have decided, for whatever reason, maybe he got a clean bill of health from his doctors, who knows, that he could still start, although he was already advanced in age, to build a proper royal tomb for himself in the Valley of the Kings, the place where all his predecessors from the 18th dynasty had been buried, or nearly all of them. This is an old watercolor from 1825, David Roberts, showing you the Valley of the Kings. Horemheb's tomb is not visible here, but it is somewhere in this area. And here's a photograph from the 1970s showing you, here's the tomb of Tutankhamun, and Horemheb is here. So they are very close together. This is a map of the Valley of the Kings showing you only the tombs that were there when Horemheb started building his tomb. And here it is. As you can see, it's a very long tomb. If you compare it to, for example, the tomb of Tutankhamun, which is tiny compared to the major royal tombs in the valley. Here's a photograph of the tomb as it was in 1907, when it was officially discovered by an expedition financed by a wealthy American businessman called Theodore Davies. He claims to have found the tomb. Surprisingly, we found inside the tomb various charcoal graffiti on the ceilings, which proved that people have actually been in the tomb in the 19th century, well before Davies so-called discovered the tomb. And here is a photograph taken in 2006 when we decided to re-excavate the tomb. This is the model that Egyptian Antiquities Service has built in the visitor center of the Valley of the Kings, and here's the tomb of Horemheb. As you can see, it's a very long tomb. Now, of course, there are several other very big tombs here, but they weren't there yet when Horemheb started building his. This is a section of the tomb. This tomb has got only 3 decorated rooms. First of all, there is the stairwell, the well room, I should call it, a room which is decorated on all 4 sides, but doesn't actually have a floor at normal floor level, but continues deep down inside the bedrock. And it has a wonderfully painted decoration with traditional scenes showing Horemheb received by the various gods of Egypt, and then in particular, of course, the gods associated with the netherworld, Osiris, Isis, Horus, etc. Here are the cartouches of Horemheb, beautifully painted over a relief decoration. Horemheb and Osiris, and the starry firmament on the ceiling. Again, Horemheb being received by Isis and Horus, two of the major gods of Egypt. Some details of the dress of the goddess Isis here. Horus. And this goddess of the west, the goddess of the necropolis, with a dress showing a feather pattern. And then we move on to the second decorated chamber, the so-called antechamber, the last chamber before you reach the actual burial hall. And this is decorated in much the same style. Again, Horemheb in front of the various gods of the underworld. There's the god Anubis with his jackal head. And here we see the first telltale signs of what we'll see in the actual burial hall. The tomb was unfinished when Horemheb had to be buried in it, as you can see here from the stars on the ceiling, which are clearly unfinished. Then we reach the burial hall, which is divided in two rooms, and in this room is the big granite sarcophagus of Horemheb, still intact. Unfortunately, no trace of the original occupant. We found a few bones inside, but they belong to about 4 or 5 different individuals, so obviously not Horemheb himself. And here's a picture of the sarcophagus. The walls of the burial hall have been decorated mostly in drawing outlines only. Apparently, the sculptors were unable to finish this room and had to abandon the work more or less within the hour. And this is very interesting from our point of view because we can follow the various stages of the work done by the various artists, like the red freehand drawing, freehand on the base of a grid, of course, and then the final drawing in black. And after that, the sculptor would have come in and executed the relief on this wall, and then it would have been painted. But you can see all the various stages clearly on the walls here. And here they have begun to hack the background around the signs and figures away to create high relief. All very interesting from an art historical point of view. There's the sun god in his boat traveling through the gates of the underworld. And when the death of Horemheb was announced, of course, they had to try and finish the tomb as much as they could. So they started to paint the scenes on the wall without any further ado. But even that was left unfinished, as you can see here. It sort of peters out in these unfinished drawings. Well, when Davies found the tomb in 1907, the whole tomb was full of rubble. Collapsed ceilings, pillars that had collapsed, and perhaps also the filling of the shaft that had been redistributed by grave robbers. And so we decided in 2006 to re-excavate the tomb. In a short season in 2006 and 2 more in 2007, we re-cleared the tomb. This is the so-called Cambridge expedition to the Valley of the Kings, led by Professor Geoffrey Martin, who's seen here, dealing with the main topic of conversation in modern Egypt, and that is money. We decided first to empty the well room, which had been completely filled with rubble by Davies and his team. It's a huge tomb, about 100 meters deep, and in 1907 they didn't take the trouble of taking out all the rubble to the surface, to outside the tomb. Instead, they redistributed it and threw a lot of the rubble down the big well room. So we decided to clear that room, which was a major undertaking. And as you can see, this room turned into a very deep shaft. And the big surprise was that in the rubble we found lots of small fragments belonging to the original furniture and funerary equipment of Haremhab. Everything was sieved very carefully outside, and you must realize that here with this stone wall above there is a path, and thousands of tourists walk there every day, looking down into the excavation and telling us what to do next. And the workmen love it too, of course, and they, especially when there are lovely young girls involved. At some stage, I decided to put an ostrakon on the wall for the tourists. It was a great success. I heard it being translated into a dozen foreign languages. So we found lots of small fragments. Unfortunately, the tomb has been robbed out, of course, that goes without saying. Here we have the head of a cobra, and if we now look at the nearly contemporary tomb of Haremhab, you see here the canopic shrine, for example, with lots of these cobra snakes, the uraeus snakes, and this could be one of the heads. But, of course, it's also possible that it comes from one of the diadems, or perhaps even from the gold mask of Haremhab himself. Who knows? We also found dozens and dozens of these trefoils made of glass, some even embedded in wood still. And these clearly come from one of the funerary beds, like this one from the tomb of Tutankhamun, which you can still see in the Cairo Museum. Also, seals on the various doorways. In Tutankhamun, we have these wonderful seals, including the standard seal of the necropolis, the jackal over the 9 prisoners, 9 bound prisoners. And fragments of those we found in the tomb of Haremhab as well. But, yeah, here are some of those fragments of ceilings. But most surprising and most important, in fact, it turned out, was the large amount of pottery we found in the burial shaft, in the big well room. All with stamped amphory handles with the name of Haremhab on them, and lots of them inscribed in hieratic. They turn out to be the fragments of the wine cellar of Haremhab. And these are of crucial importance for the dating of the tomb. Many of these so-called wine dockets have a year date, the date in which the wine was bottled. We have 60 dockets with the beginning of the text. 14 of them start with the indication of the regnal year, but the actual figure is missing. But there are 46 where the year date has actually been preserved or partly been preserved. 22 of them have the year 13. That's the sign for 10, and then 3 strokes for 3, 13. And 8 further dockets have year 14. We have not found a single docket that gives us more than year 14. We have found quite a few with the number of the year incomplete, but we can say with safety that none of them are give a year date higher than year 19. For example, here 10 plus the missing further numeral, that must be something between 10 and 19. It can't be 20 because that's a different sign. Then we have 11. And you'll wonder, why is this not 11 to 19? That is because in this particular form of Egyptian, the hieratic script, the first 4 numerals are written with vertical strokes. But after 5, the sign changes. So once you have the first downstroke, even if it breaks off after the first, you can then only have 2, 3, or 4, not 5. So 3 with year 11, that is years 11 to 14, and then 2 of year 12, 12 to 14, and 1 with year 13, which could be 13 or 14, but not higher. And then finally, we have only 5 dockets in which the first sign is missing. So theoretically, that could be 13, 23, 33, 43, etc. But they are very few. And it is very unlikely that these 5 dockets suddenly belong to very much higher dates. So it looks like it's virtually certain that Haremhab only had wine from his 13th and 14th year. Here's a complete example from year 13, and some more. They all have the same text. Year 13, wine of the estate of Haremhab from the domain of Amun, from the western river, that means from the western part of the Egyptian delta, and then the name of the vintner called T. And here an example of 14, another one, year 14, year 14, good quality wine of Haremhab, of the estate of Amun, and then from the vineyard of this domain, which is next to the temple of Thoth. So it looks very likely that Haremhab's tomb was supplied with a large shipment of ordinary wine from the western delta, bottled in year 13, and a limited number of choice wines bottled in year 14, coming from various vineyards from all over Egypt. And from this, the conclusion is almost inescapable that Haremhab must have been buried before the wine harvest of year 15. Now, this conclusion has been, the length of the year of the reign of Haremhab has been hotly debated for as long as Egyptology exists. Many Egyptologists have maintained that Haremhab reigned for at least 28 years, and sometimes people say even 30 or 35 years. It is now virtually certain that he reigned for no more than 14 years and a bit. And this has thrown a big cat among the pigeons. I am now in the position that I can recline and wait for others to sort out the problem that this has caused in the chronology of ancient Egypt and the rest of the Middle East. To be frank, I've always doubted that Haremhab reigned for as long as people have maintained, because if you compare the tomb of one of his immediate successors, King Seti I, which is about the same size, and you look at the amount of rooms that have been decorated by these two kings, the rooms that are indicated in red have been completely decorated. As you can see, only two rooms, two smallish rooms, are finished in the tomb of Haremhab. The yellow bits are unfinished. Yet, Seti I reigned for certainly no more than a decade, probably 8 years and a week, no longer. And yet he managed to finish this tomb nearly completely. How would it have been possible for Haremhab to reign for 28 years or even longer and not be able to finish his royal tomb? That would have been inconceivable. So I've always doubted that Haremhab reigned for such a long time, and this appears to have been confirmed by our recent excavations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, I am Jonah Roos, curator of in charge of the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. But now it is time to turn our attention eastward and a little later in time, so we can't debate what you've brought up right now. Our next speaker is Dr. Timothy P. Harrison, who has been a professor of Near Eastern and Middle Eastern civilizations at the University of Toronto since 1997. Throughout his career, he has focused on the archaeology of the Eastern Mediterranean with important work on sites in Jordan, Israel, and Turkey. His 1995 doctoral dissertation for the University of Chicago was on the early Bronze Age of Highland Central Jordan, and he is also director of the archaeological excavations at the Bronze and Iron Age site of Tel Madaba, a place otherwise famous for its Byzantine map of the Holy Land and nearby Mount Nebo. As a research associate at the Oriental Institute, Dr. Harrison turned his attention to the site of Megiddo, where he was engaged in the publication of Stratum 6, tackling issues related to the transformation from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age in the Levant. The interest in this complex transition in the Near East and the Mediterranean, the so-called Dark Ages, that intervened between the Bronze Age of the second millennium BC and the Middle and Late Iron Age of the first, makes Tim Harrison the perfect choice to address the subject of the Wilkinson Lectures today, Rulers in Times of Transition, as inspired by the Haremhab exhibition. These centuries of darkness, to use the title of a well-known book, have been greatly illuminated by Tim Harrison's groundbreaking work as director of excavations of the Tel Tainat archaeological project on the plain of Antioch in modern southeastern Turkey, which is part of a wider interregional research effort seeking to shed light on the development of urban life and state formation, state-ordered society, and the diverse cultural environment of the Syro-Hittite world. This archaeological effort has been complemented by his penetrating studies with tantalizing titles, such as Lifting the Veil on a Dark Age, Tainat and the North Orontes Valley during the Early Iron Age, the Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age Transition in the North Orontes Valley, Neo-Hittites in the land of Palistin, and the forthcoming Landscapes of Power, Neo-Hittite Citadels in Comparative Perspective. I first met Tim Harrison in Istanbul last year during a fascinating conference organized by our colleague Aslıhan Yener at Koç University, which was entitled Across the Border, bringing together many scholars working in Turkey and Syria to wrestle with issues such as the Dark Ages and to share significant discoveries made on both sides of the modern border. After Tim Harrison's presentation of his spectacular finds from Tel Tainat and thoughtful insights on its history, I knew we had to find an opportunity for him to speak to us, as we ourselves are preparing a new exhibition on interconnections in the first millennium BC. As I have mentioned, the Wilkinson Lectures this year, with their focus on seminal periods of transition in Egypt and the Near East, seemed ideal, and despite his busy schedule both at the university and now as president of the American Schools of Oriental Research, a post he took up in 2007, Tim responded enthusiastically to our request for him to speak to us today, coming down from what we used to refer to as the frozen north before this January, but now we reluctantly share this honor as well. So please join me in warmly welcoming Timothy Harrison, who will speak to us today about Taita, ruler of the land of Palestine, lifting the veil on a dark age.
Thank you, Joan, for that introduction, and also for the invitation and the opportunity to come and speak here in New York. I often, when I come to the States to give a talk during the winter, I'm often blamed as being the one who brings the cold weather with me. But I'll have to say on this trip, the roles have been reversed. I can assure you that there is more snow on the ground here in downtown Manhattan by more than a meter than there was up in Toronto before I left that town yesterday. So I don't have any guilty conscience, I guess, standing here before you this afternoon. Taita, the ruler whom I have chosen to speak about this afternoon, is a challenging subject, and a controversial one at that. Challenging because we know very little about him. In fact, we did not even know of his existence a decade ago. And controversial because of the historical implications of the one political claim we know he made. The discovery of the Temple of the Storm God in Aleppo has been one of the great archaeological finds of the past decade. In 1996, the German archaeologist Kai Kohlmeier, working in collaboration with the Aleppo Museum, began excavations in the center of the Aleppo citadel as part of an effort to restore some of its monuments. By 2002, his team had uncovered the north wall of a large building with a stunning array of 26 carved stone reliefs that you see here, some of them you see here. In 2003, he completed the clearance of the east wall, revealing in the center of the magnificent preserved figures of the storm god of Aleppo, with a human figure facing him, and both flanked by alternating false windows and bullmen. Even more dramatic was the presence of an 11-line hieroglyphic Luwian inscription. We've been hearing about Egyptian hieroglyphics. Many don't realize there is a second hieroglyphic tradition in the Near East, that one associated with Anatolia, what I'll be referring to here as hieroglyphic Luwian. This inscription, incised and almost completely preserved, starts from the mouth of this figure in this vicinity here and works its way down these registers behind this figure, almost comic book quote-like in its organization. In content, the inscription is a rather banal temple dedication. Its great interest and importance, however, lie in the name, the titles, and country of the figure, which reads, "I am King Taita, hero, the ruler of the land of Palistin. For my lord the Halabian storm god, I honored the image." And it continues with the rest of the dedication. So here we have this figure, who we now know to be Taita, facing the storm god. We also can confirm the name, or the person of the storm god, with the epigraph above the head of the figure on the left. And the inscription continues, as I said. Between 2004 and 2006, the southern entrance of the temple was excavated, revealing the relief figures of a fishman and lion, and broken figures of a sphinx and a second lion, the latter two bearing yet a second broken inscription. And this one, I won't be able to show you images of it. This is too recent. But here you see, looking from the inside, facing outward through the entrance to this large temple, and flanking the one side of the entrance are these four figures, including this fishman figure, and then this partially restored sphinx. And it's on this sphinx, on its crown, and then I don't have the image of it, a second lion figure. We have the makings of a second inscription. This dramatic discovery preserves virtually the entire historical record we have for Taita. Yet it has become increasingly clear that he was a pivotal figure in ancient Near Eastern history, and in some ways he has come to symbolize the revolution underway in our understanding of the formative centuries of the early Iron Age in the Eastern Mediterranean world, the period roughly between 1200 and 900 BCE. Taita certainly, therefore, embodies the theme of this year's Wilkinson's lectures, rulers in times of transition. The collapse of the large centralized states of the late Bronze Age in the late second millennium BCE, with their rich administrative and literary archives, and we just heard something of that in the previous talk. This event famously attributed in part to the Sea Peoples that you see here, depicted on the famous Sea Peoples relief of Ramses II's mortuary temple in West Thebes. And the subsequent emergence of the small nation-states of biblical fame during the ensuing Iron Age have long fascinated both scholar and public alike. The intervening early Iron Age, contrastingly, has remained largely obscured, generally seen as a disruptive historical interlude or dark age, marked by political fragmentation, ethnic strife, and cultural devolution. However, recent archaeological excavations and a growing corpus of epigraphic discoveries have begun to lift the obscuring veil on this elusive period, revealing an intriguing historical era, the emerging pictures of a considerably more complex cultural and political landscape, shaped by powerful forces of both change and continuity. The pace of discovery has been particularly pronounced in the Hittite realm of central Anatolia and northwest Syria. And it has forced a thorough revision of long-standing views about the Hittite Empire's political fortunes during its final stages and in the aftermath of its collapse. While scholars have long assumed that the Neo-Hittite states of the first millennium BCE were linked culturally and linguistically to their Bronze Age Anatolian forebears, thus far, only the great kings of Carchemish have produced a dynastic line that actually bridges this intervening era, while archaeologically we have lacked well-excavated cultural sequences from this period. So here I want to start with a map that more or less traces what we believe to be the extent of the Hittite Empire at the end of the Bronze Age. And I just want this image hopefully to stay in your minds, and I'll return to it at the end of my talk. And as I mentioned, the one historical record that we have, piecemeal but nevertheless more or less intact, thanks to the work of Professor David Hawkins, a preeminent scholar in Hittite studies, as you see here, more or less pieces together a dynastic succession that spans the end of the Hittite period in the late 13th century and all the way down into the 10th and 9th centuries that mark the rise of these so-called Syro-Hittite states. The discovery of the Aleppo inscriptions, however, have now raised the prospect of tracing the historical development of an early Iron Age polity associated with Taita's land of Palistin, which, as I will attempt to demonstrate, was centered at the large Iron Age site of Tel Tainat, located in the North Orontes Valley of southeastern Turkey. The archaeological remains of early Iron Age Tainat thus present an exciting opportunity to explore the historical experience of a community that played a prominent role during this formative era. The evidence points to the emergence of a powerful regional state comprised of an intriguing amalgam of Aegean, Anatolian, or I would prefer Luvian, and Bronze Age West Syrian cultural traditions. This kingdom, known to the Assyrians in the later Iron Age as Patina, was eventually destroyed in 738 BCE by Tiglath-Pileser III, who then transformed Tainat into an Assyrian provincial capital. Just to close in on the vicinity, so here you see the immediate environs of the North Orontes Valley, what we refer to as the Amuk Plain today, with classical Antioch, situated there, modern-day Antakya, and about 30 kilometers to the east, the twin settlements of Tainat and Tel Achana, ancient Alalak, being excavated by my colleague and friend Aslihan Yener, that Joan mentioned at Koç University. And here's another slide to give you a sense of the landscape, just to point out something that's important that will come up, I think, a little bit later, is you see the river of the Orontes meandering here and the dark shadow on this satellite image, more or less in this vicinity, roughly about a 5-kilometer wide floodplain that encompasses both the site of Tainat and of Echana. So these two sites essentially are, in terms of the surface that you can see above the top of the current plain, are literally the tip of the iceberg of much larger settlements now buried by the grading floodplain over the centuries. So it's an important component of our research, has been contending with this very active geological context. Excavations were conducted back in the 1930s by the so-called Syro-Hittite expedition, a large project directed by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, and involving a number of very prominent archaeologists. Perhaps most familiar here with would be Robert Braidwood. And you can see here the large-scale excavations that were conducted at Tel Tainat between 1935 and 1938 of that expedition. The expedition was brought to an end with hostilities on the eve of the Second World War, before the expedition had completed its objectives, and then never went back, never returned. So while they did manage to expose large quantities of the latter Iron Age levels of the site, much of the earlier settlement remained unexcavated. Also, for reference, you might be able to see in the back of this photograph another mound. That is the mound of Echana, or ancient Alalak, and this little black blob here are the structures of the dig house of that expedition, which was directed by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley. So both expeditions were in the field at the same time, literally staring each other down across the valley a few hundred meters apart. The Chicago excavations produced a very impressive sequence of large monumental buildings, primarily palaces, now referred to as Bitilani Palace Complex, and here you see the most famous of them, Building 1, and various parts of the structure, including these beautifully carved column bases, one example there up close, and another one here in situ as well. So as a result of this Syro-Hittite expedition's investigations back in the 1930s, we have this Iron Age sequence, but we also have historical sources, mainly in the form of the royal annals of the Neo-Assyrian kings. We can piece together from those records part of a king list and something of a political history of a small kingdom known as the Kingdom of Patina that functioned in this region in the 9th and 8th centuries, before, as I said, it was taken and destroyed by Tiglath-Pileser in 738 BC. So here you see part of that king list and some of the events associated with those rulers. I'll come back to this at the end of my talk. Here you can see the geography of this kingdom and its neighbors, one of the so-called Syro-Hittite states of the 9th and 8th centuries. And as I mentioned, brought to a destructive end in 738 by Tiglath-Pileser III during his second campaign in 738. So here's a chronological chart. I'll resist going into detail here, but I just want to point out for context, essentially the Syro-Hittite expedition identified 5 large architectural phases, what they called building periods. Building period 1 being the earliest, the last one being building period 5. And the earliest one, building period 1, that you see here, included 2 large structures, buildings 13 and 14, and a complex that they dated roughly to the late 9th century, or late 10th century, early 9th century at the very earliest. So I'll come back to that complex in a little bit. But the main point here I want to emphasize is that the period that we're interested in, from 1200 down to 900, this early Iron Age period, the so-called Dark Age, essentially was a gap with only traces of some presence from this period found or recognized in the Syro-Hittites excavations. However, during their excavations, they encountered a number of isolated features and large architectural elements, the most impressive ones including this large column base, more than 1.5 meters in diameter, much larger than the other ones that they had found in situ in the Bitillani palaces that I showed you earlier. This one you can see clearly found out of context on the surface of the mound, but also part of a massive or enormous colossal figure. Here you see the head as it's been restored. It is on display in the Oriental Institute Museum in Chicago. If you venture to Chicago, it's worth a visit to see. And a figure that, if the proportions of the head are any indication, must have been more than 2 meters in height, maybe as much as 2.5 meters in height. So a truly colossal figure. But also, most importantly, more than 90 fragments of these hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions that I alluded to. These, however, found scattered throughout their excavations in various secondary and tertiary contexts, and something that the original expedition was unable to make much sense of. Very important for our story here this afternoon, so keep them in mind. I'll return again to them at the end of my talk. Now, with the time I have, I want to shift to our own expedition, the Taita Archaeological Project, and I will give you a summary of what we've accomplished to date. Before I do, I just want to emphasize two things. One is to emphasize that the work you will be seeing, the results you'll be seeing, are the composite of a large team. The expedition is a large group, and I'm able to report on the work of others here as the project director. And I wish to acknowledge that team effort. We have a fantastic group, and they've produced, I think, great results. And what you'll see here is not just simply my own work. The second is also to acknowledge the support we've received over the years from a variety of benefactors and funding sources. So in 1999, we began surveying the landscape around Taita, including generating a surface collection, as well as a topographic map. And here is very important to grasp and grapple with this sedimentation problem caused by the flooding of the Orontes River nearby. And you can see in this image on the left, essentially the results of our contour map, the production of a topo map that produced the outline of what is essentially the upper mound of the site. And then secondly, it may be hard to see, but there is a single contour that wanders out here into the lower part of the site. And it's very gratifying in that satellite image I showed earlier that when we calculated our topographic data, this contour dropped right down after we georeferenced the satellite image in with our topographic data around this white shadow that you see on that blown up satellite image. And it clearly marks the outline of a lower settlement, a settlement that you can't see if you visit the site today. It's hidden by the alluviation from the nearby river. So we can tell you that based on that topographic data, as well as this satellite image, that there's an extensive lower site. Together, the upper mound and the lower mound must be more than 40 hectares in size. I thought at the end of our survey work that we had essentially established the parameters of the site. However, this geomorphological complexity that we're grappling with has taken away some of my confidence, because we've also done a variety of remote sensing techniques. We've done geomagnetic work, some resistivity work in the lower area, trying to map, if you will, any subsurface features in this area. And that takes you to this image on the right. It's a compressed composite of linear features, let's say walls and structures, from a complex deposit of multiple strata of a lower city in this area. And what's interesting in part in this situation, maybe you can see the red line here, is that the area that we've mapped using these remote sensing techniques extends beyond that contour. And to our surprise, the features continue out into that area. So as we've done further field work, I'm not sure anymore where the limits or the extent of our settlement actually is. The other major bit of work we've done is to core. We've done more than 50 cores. These yellow dots you see here represent the cores that we've taken. And they've begun to give us a broad, let's say, macroscopic view of the stratigraphic profile of the lower mound. And it's enabled us to begin reconstructing the paleoenvironment. And as an example, this is from a little bit later period in time, roughly the mid-9th century, but we can take that paleoenvironmental data and predict, based on what we found, that in fact the area around Taita might have been either flooded, like you see here, or more bog-like, most likely. And that has been, in some ways, confirmed, I think, by a very interesting image found on one of the registers of the famous Neo-Syrian reliefs, the Balawat Gates in Assyria, that date to the reign of Shalmaneser III, the mid-9th century, which shows people from the kingdom of Patina, or Unki, as they're referred to in this particular text, bringing tribute, and they're associated with a walled or fortified structure, which up close here you may see has what we think are representations of some kind of water or marine-like context. So it seems that this contemporary image fits well with the paleoenvironmental data on that particular level of the site. Now, in 2004, we began excavations. It's a small 2-week pilot season, and you can see here the area of that excavation. We wanted to try and return to the area that the Syro-Hittite expedition had focused on in the 1930s, what they referred to as the west central area. And you can see that area on the satellite image again, marked by this dark shadow or scar. And our excavations then we set up at the edge of that area in an attempt to try and reconnect with the earlier excavations. And here you see a plan of the principal Bitalani Palace Complex, Building 1, and a very intriguing building associated with it, a much smaller, modest structure, Building 2. It's a building that has drawn a lot of attention as it's a temple and has often been used as an analogous structure to the Solomonic Temple in Jerusalem. That's another whole story, and it has its problems, but just for reference, I mentioned that here. Our excavations, however, came down on part of the north wall of that structure immediately, so we were able to, in a sense, reconnect almost immediately to the old excavation area, which was very gratifying. What surprised us as we penetrated into the earlier unexcavated parts of the site were the remains we found. Rather modest structures. You see a composite here of about 4 stratigraphic levels of very modest buildings, including little rectilinear or rectangular buildings like you see here, but also numerous large silo-like structures that you see here. All part of an early Iron Age, roughly 12th century complex at the site. So actually about 300 or 400 years earlier than the temple that was built on top of it. Essentially what we can say today had happened here was that the construction of this temple, which took place sometime in the late 9th century, the architects essentially carved out much of the earlier 9th, 10th, and 11th century deposits. So we have a direct connection, though, into this earlier Iron Age material going back to the 12th, and it turns out even into the 13th century, we think. That deposit included, to our surprise, large quantities of painted wares, variously known as Mycenaean 3C1 or Late Helladic 3C. And you see an example of some of the most common forms, the so-called bell-shaped bowls here from each of the main phases. More than half of our diagnostic pottery from these levels are comprised of this painted ware tradition associated with the Aegean world. However, in our case, this material is clearly of local manufacture. It's not a part of an imported potting tradition. So this is something to keep in mind. And just to give you one more quick image of the range of this material, it includes primarily geometric and linear patterns, but here also are a few pictorial motifs, part of a little bird-like figure on this sherd. And this one, very interesting, this one has drawn a lot of speculation from our team, a human representation, and on this bottom one, a crater, are a series of fish. Not too many pictorial motifs, but we do find them as well. The other interesting thing, though, in our pottery sequence from this early Iron Age context is the substantial presence, not quite half, maybe 40% of the assemblage are what we call local plain wares, otherwise known as Hittite monochrome ware, or by the less attractive name drab ware. It's a potting tradition directly linked back to the late Bronze Age, to the time of the Hittite Empire. And it's a well-established potting industry that we know a lot about from that late Bronze Age context. What is of interest here is the fact that we find this material together with the Mycenaean 3C pottery in this early 12th century context. On the right are what we refer to as red slip burnishware, so-called Hittite spindle bottles, again reflective of a late Bronze Age potting tradition. And then at the bottom here is one example of a so-called Anatolian greyware vessel. We have more of that as well, pottery that has been sourced to the Western Anatolian or Aegean context. So a very, very interesting mix of pottery. In this context also we found a large concentration of tools, primarily loom weights, and you see the loom weights primarily in the upper left-hand corner here, two primary types, a cylindrical and then a shape, and then a hourglass-shaped type. But we found now several hundreds of these in this Field 1 area associated with the Mycenaean potting tradition and so forth. And you see here also some of the other tools, including spindle whorls and spatulas and awls, that were part of this interesting textile industry. Also with it, we have found various jewelry, and then quite exciting, it's a rather small piece, you can see here for scale, about a centimeter, but a piece of impression of textile that we found on a piece of clay, and it's been clear enough for us to be able to identify the weave pattern, and from that we've been able to infer that the impression, or the textile that the impression was made from, was produced on a warp-weighted loom. So we're able to reconstruct increasingly information about the textile industry, and has also shown that, at least in terms of the immediate Late Bronze, Early Iron Age context, that this was a reintroduction, if you will, of a technology that had not been in practice in this region, in the immediate vicinity anyway, in the Late Bronze Age period. So we're finding here both evidence of craft industries that show continuity with the Bronze Age traditions that preceded, but also new technologies that are being introduced as well. The third craft industry of interest is a workshop. We have found also in our early Iron Age levels part of a little metal workshop or smith, and it has interestingly included the production of both iron and bronze or copper tools, and found in the context in our archaeometrical analysis of this material has indicated that this area was the scene of both smithing and other aspects of production involving, as far as we can tell from the chemistry, both the production of copper tools and iron tools in the same environment of this modest little workshop you see located here. This is where one of the main firing platforms is located. This, again, in an early 12th or early Iron Age context, and we can base that on the associated pottery and radiocarbon evidence. And here you see some of the tools that were found in that vicinity, both bronze and iron implements. And lastly, there's a lot more evidence here I won't go into this afternoon, involving things like faunal data and paleoethnobotanical data that speak to the diet or culinary practices of this population. But also, intriguingly, and we only have about a dozen examples of this so far, but here you see part of an inscribed potter's handle, and this very similar motif to potting handles from a similar kind of pottery, also from the same context, more or less, or time frame, at the site of Ashkelon in Israel to the south. And it has recently been proposed that these signs might actually be somehow related to the Supraminoan script going back into the Bronze Age. So we may even have epigraphic evidence speaking of newcomers, or if you will, or new traditions, linguistic traditions in this context. So to summarize, we now have 4 clear stratigraphic phases at Tainat that is filling in this gap that previously existed between the end of the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1200, and then the earliest levels reached by the Syro-Hittite expedition back in the 1930s, which they dated to roughly the beginning of the 9th century. The second area I want to focus on has to do with the next major stratum that seals over the Field 1 area, the early Iron Age, and this dates to roughly the 11th and 10th century, and you can see the excavations beginning in that area here. In the foreground is our Field 1, and this is our Field 2, and in this area we have come down now on a massive building with walls that measure more than 3 meters in width, And in some of the soundings where we've gone to the base of the walls, as you can see, for example, in this corner here, walls that have gone down more than 3 meters in depth. So parts of a massive structure. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to locate good surfaces associated with this massive building. So at this point, we have a plan, and you can see here the exposures that we've achieved so far. And I'll have to say this is perhaps not the most politic statement to make, but one of the reasons we don't have good surfaces has to do with a trench that was cut along the face of the eastern wall of this building. You can see it marked by this gray box here. Beautiful surfaces over here, including stone surfaces and then pottery-strewn surfaces, all cut by this trench, which goes back to the 1930s Syro-Hittite expedition. They were trenching along the sides of the walls trying to outline this building. Unfortunately, in the process, they severed some of the most important chronological indicators that we can have to help date it. However, what I can tell you is that this material has to fit into a context that associates it with the building period 1 horizon that I mentioned earlier, which included building 14, if you recall, as I mentioned at the beginning. And the Syro-Hittite expedition was able to piece together a building. Now, this was very fragmentary, and it was a result of them making soundings through the floors of the later buildings, the Bitylani palaces that they placed in their building period 2. So it was very fragmentary. The exposures that they succeeded in achieving and the composite that they put together here may well be parts of multiple buildings. If it were to be one building, it would be more than 100 meters north-south by more than 50 meters east-west. So an enormous, enormous structure, much larger than the later buildings that they encountered. For our part, our excavations can say quite confidently that we've now hit the southeast corner of this building, and that's what I showed you in the earlier slide. The other thing I can say about it is that it clearly stratigraphically was sealed by the buildings of the second building period. That included the building 1, Bitylani, that I've already referred to, the little temple, and the other structures here you see in plan, and here you see in an isometric. These all form part of the Syro-Hittite expedition's building period 2, which we can date quite confidently to the late 9th, maybe as early as mid-9th at the earliest, but in any case, late 9th and 8th centuries. This is the horizon that was essentially destroyed by Tiglath-Pileser in 738, in the later part of the 8th century. So this complex seals the structure that we've encountered, so it stratigraphically has to predate the mid-9th century, and it in turn seals those earlier Iron Age deposits I mentioned, which we've dated to the 12th and perhaps late 13th century, so it cannot predate that context. So this structure must, the building 14 or the building period 1 complex must fit somewhere in the 11th or 10th, maybe at the latest early 9th century context. So it gives us parameters, even if at this point I can't give you precise dates. So that's our second major cultural stratum, and I'll come back to this in a little bit later. And here you can see it summarized. So this is the early Iron Age sequence of the 12th, maybe even the early 11th century. And then here's our building 1 complex, which must start from the mid to early 9th century at the latest and move back into that earlier Iron Age context. Now to return to Taita. Who then was Taita? So here I want to try and sketch in. Before I do that, I want to just throw a little sidelight. This is an excursion. It's something that we've drawn a lot of attention to, and it's something I can't really fit fully into our story. But as we tried to, so hold on Taita a moment, we'll come back to him. But here you see part of a large building that we stumbled upon quite by accident in our 2008 and 9 seasons. As we were trying to grapple with the stratigraphic issue that I mentioned, we began moving further to the east, and we came down, as you can see, I think here, right below the surface. This is the surface of the mound in an area that fortunately had not been touched by the Syro-Hittite expedition, and right literally below the surface, we came down on this large temple that had been untouched by both subsequent farming activity and also by the Syro-Hittite excavations. And we produced, among other things, some very interesting architectural features, including this beautifully carved column base in situ here, somewhat broken, but we can restore it. And it looks both in size and in iconographic design almost identical to the column bases of the Bitilani palaces slightly to the west of it. So probably contemporary, if you will. And secondly, in the back chamber here, where you see this kind of elevated podium or platform, we found in the destruction debris. This structure had been burnt intensely in a conflagration. We found a hoard of artifacts. In fact, the mud brick of the exterior walls had been fired so intensely that some of the mud brick collapse that had come from the superstructure had fused and vitrified with the walls of the building. So some intense burning that brought this building to an end. But as they say in archaeology, someone else's tragedy is often the archaeologist's boon. For us, that was certainly the case in this context because that back chamber produced a hoard of small finds, including, you can see here, pieces of gold jewelry, fixings that were probably part of either furniture, as you can see in the piece of bronze here on the right, or perhaps even for hangings or other kinds of fixtures that may have been adjoining the walls of this building. And then a host of small finds, a little scaraboid and jewelry, and this beautiful little stone pyxis as part of a scene, a funerary scene, a feasting scene with a figure here at the funerary table in marking the afterlife. But also, quite excitingly, a cache of cuneiform tablets. And I don't have time to go into this, but I just bring this up because a lot of people ask me about it. It doesn't pertain directly to our story here this afternoon. It has nothing to do with Taita, but it does. It is part of the results of our excavation, and it includes this large tablet, more than 43 centimeters in size from top to bottom, and about 28 centimeters across, as you see it here coming out of the ground, up on the platform, along with some of the other associated artifacts that were in the destruction. This is part of what was once referred to as the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon. We can date this treaty document precisely to the day and year, according to both historical references, but also to the seal on the tablet, dated to the second month, I think we believe the 16th day, and the year 672 BC. It has to do with the Assyrian presence at the site. As I said, it's part of another story, but a very, very intriguing one that I'll have to just throw out there as a teaser. Perhaps I can come and talk about it on another day. The other thing to say about this temple is that it is an almost identical match to the earlier building I mentioned that was excavated by the Syro-Hittite expedition. And you see here with its most famous artifact of those excavations, this beautifully carved column base with these two flanking lions, which you can see in the Antioch Museum still today. And you can see for scale the size. It's to my mind, certainly biased one of the most beautifully carved sculptures in the Near East, certainly from the Iron Age period. So these two temples, when you plot them together, here is our new temple. We are calling it Building 16. And here is the earlier one with a stone pavement. We haven't excavated this area yet, but clearly part of a temple complex, what I've begun calling a sacred precinct. A very, very intriguing situation. And I will come back to one feature right here at the end in a few minutes, so hold that in your mind as well. So finally, back to Taita to try and present at least a scenario where I think he fits into the story and why I think he is so important for our understanding of this early Iron Age period. So who then was Taita? Can we say anything more historically about him and his kingdom? As it happens, and this is something that we often find ourselves having to admit as historians or as archaeologists, when new discoveries are made, we start revisiting the historical and archaeological record and discover that there were things we'd missed. And this is the story of Taita. This is true of Taita. As it happens, there were additional references to him and to the land of Palistin. First of all, an obscure, so this is just that earlier image from the Aleppo temple. An obscure pair of hieroglyphic Luvian stelae were discovered many years ago at two small adjacent sites, the sites of Meherde and Cesar, near Hama in west-central Syria. The Meherde stela that you see here on the right bears a female figure in a long dress standing, and I don't have her here. I don't have that part of here standing on the back of a couchant lion. Sorry, I have that backward here. The Cesar stela on the left, you can see the figure here standing with a smaller figure on her left, also in a long dress, standing on the lion's head. And maybe you can see her here. And then the lion that they are standing on right here. The inscription identifies the stela as a dedicatory monument to the divine queen of the land, while the Cesar stela apparently is the funerary monument of Taita's wife and records that she lived to be 100 years old. In both these inscriptions, Taita is entitled, so here we have two more references to Taita, the same basic reference that we have in the Aleppo inscription. Taita is entitled Hero of the Land. Here a slight variant, Walasatini, clearly a variant spelling of the Palistin mentioned in the Aleppo inscriptions. And there is more. One of the hieroglyphic Luvian fragments recovered at Tel Tainat by the Syro-Hittite expedition, referred to as the Tel Tainat inscription number 1, also bears reference to this toponym Walasatin. Already in 1975, an Italian scholar had suggested that this term was a designation for the Emuk plain in the North Orontes Valley. Furthermore, one of the inscription 1 fragments makes reference to an individual named Halaparuntas. I don't have that fragment on here. I've only selected out the piece that preserves the Walasatin fragment or reference. This Halaparuntas is very possibly the same ruler reported by the Assyrians to have paid tribute to their king Shalmaneser III in 857 and again in 853 BCE, providing us with a mid-9th century date for this Tainat ruler. So we have here another figure, and this king Halaparuntas is associated with this place, this reference Walasatin or Palasatin. Returning to Taita, if his kingdom was based in the Emuk, the range of his operations, as attested by his monuments, would have been extensive. As Professor Hawkins has observed, these inscriptions collectively infer the existence of an early Iron Age kingdom encompassing an area that extended east to include Aleppo and south as far as the district of Hama. In this context, it is worth noting the close correspondence between the apparent territorial extent of his kingdom and the combined territories of the late Bronze Age Hittite vassal kingdom of Mukish, which was based at Alalak, so centered in this area here, Niya and Nukhashe, two other vassal states which more or less covered this area to the south, which were consolidated, we know from historical sources, under the control of Aleppo during the reign of Shupililiuma I, the empire builder of the Hittite dynasty in Hattusha, during his administrative reorganization of this region in the 14th century. So we have an outline, and what the circle here is a very hypothetical one. It encompasses these sites of Meherde and Cesar in the vicinity of Hama, Aleppo to the east, and a few more here with Tainat in the center. Most recently, in 2008, reports of the discovery of 2 intact hieroglyphic Luvian stelae at a site on the grounds of a military base near Arsus, which you see here, southwest of Alexandria, or Iskandarun as it is today, on the Mediterranean coast, have now added still more historical clues. Though still unpublished, a recent presentation of these inscriptions added 2 more king names to the list associated with the kingdom of Walastin. The 2 virtually identical texts record the activities of a king by the name of Suppiluliuma, very similar to the earlier Hittite king I just named, and it describes him as hero king of Walastin, and it names his father as King Manana. Among his accomplishments, he describes campaigns against the city of Adana in the land of Hiawa, or ancient, which we know to have been ancient Cilicia. So there's Adana over here in this vicinity. Suppiluliuma and his father Manana clearly must predate the earliest previously known Ptinian king, Lubarnes, encountered by the Assyrians during Ashurbanipal II's reign raid through the region in 870 BCE, placing his rule in the late 9th or 10th century. So we can begin to push this political history back into this Dark Age context. And therefore, Taita presumably must still be earlier in this context, sometime in the 10th century or possibly even back into the 11th century. Finally, I should mention the biblical references to Toi, king of Hamath, mentioned in the second book of Samuel, and the alliance of his son Joram with the Israelite king David. It has very recently, just this past year, been argued that Toi might well have been Taita, based on an analysis of the etymology of the two names, Taita and Toi. If, and I recognize this to be a key point, if this link can be made, it would suggest that Taita, or Toi, had installed his son as ruler of Hamath within his larger kingdom, a plausible Luvian or Hittite practice going back to the Hittite Empire period. And this I used to refer back to Suppiluliuma I, who installed his sons at Aleppo, and also off the map here at Carchemish, back already in the 14th century. So it was a well-established political practice to establish one's son as a viceroy of one of the districts or sectors of the kingdom. It of course also provide a more secure date for his reign in the late 11th or early 10th century, if we could make this link, while shedding further historical light on the extent of his kingdom and his political influence. So to return to my chronological chart at the beginning, before a few years ago, this is a chart I used to give exclusively in my talks with the earliest dates to reference to this Lubarna, king of Ptina, encountered by Ashur-nasirpal, the Assyrian king, on his raid in 870. That was the earliest reference we could make. But with these new inscriptions, we can now begin to push that back further, his political history further. So we now have Suppiluliuma, king of Palistin, who campaigns against Adana in the land of Hiawa, sometime in the early 9th century at the very, very latest, or more likely the 10th century. And then before him we know was his father, who also ruled the land of Palistin, so therefore sometime presumably in the 10th century. And then moving further back in time, we would have, if we can accept the link between Toi and Taita, the reference to his son Joram as the viceroy of Hamath, who forms this alliance, we're told in the second book of Samuel, with David, king of Israel. That would place us in the 10th century as well. And then finally to the Taita reliefs at Aleppo, again, sometime in the 10th, perhaps as early as the 11th century. Returning to Tainat, as I have noted, the Syro-Hittite expedition recovered a substantial number of fragmentary hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions, now more than 100 when you count our own discovered fragments. Our investigation of the expedition's field records indicate that these epigraphic remains were recovered from a wide range of secondary and tertiary contexts in the west central area, broadly associated with the first and second building periods. When plotted spatially, these fragments including those of the Tainat 1 inscription I've mentioned, cluster tightly around building 14. So here you can see these colored dots, which are linked to the different inscription groups. Here in light blue is the outline of our building 14, and you can see how they've clustered in this area based on our proveniencing from the Syro-Hittite field records. The provenance of the Tainat hieroglyphic Luvian inscriptions thus currently offer us our most concrete archaeological context for the seat of Taita's kingdom. And as a tantalizing clue to the potential of these inscriptions, last point here we'd like to refer back to our building, 16, our temple, with this little feature in the forecourt. During the last days of the Syro-Hittite expedition's excavations in 1938, they did a little trench that radiated out eastward from their Building 1 Bithyllani Palace. You can see the trench coming this direction, and they came down on this little feature, didn't know what to make of it, left, never came back, and it was essentially forgotten. When we georeference that into our plan, we found that it fits smack in front of our new temple. Moreover, as we've plotted all of these different fragments, Tainat inscription 2, which includes these fragments that you see here, and forms a kind of square block-like stela, are all concentrated in this vicinity of this installation. And it's very tempting to suggest that it once stood on top of that platform in front of our temple. Now, this is speculating because we haven't gone yet below the floors of the terminal phase of the temple, which clearly dates to the Assyrian period, late 8th century and later. But it's possible we may have here a destroyed monument from an earlier Hittite complex, and therefore something that puts us back into that context as well. To conclude, while it is clear that the collapse of the Hittite Empire at the end of the Late Bronze Age created a political vacuum that fostered an era of prolonged regional instability, as we have seen, there is also growing evidence of cultural and political continuity. In key centers of Hittite power, such as at Carchemish, Hittite imperial control appears to have survived in the form of diminished rump states, to invoke a term that Hawkins has used, ruled by dynastic lines with direct ancestral links to the royal family at Hattusha. Interspersed between these reduced enclaves of Hittite influence, rival political centers also began to materialize, reflecting their own newly emergent cultural and linguistic traditions. The result was a highly fragmented political landscape, or a mosaic, if you will, within which a diverse cultural and ethnic milieu was able to develop and flourish. This cultural and political ferment provided the stimulus that forged the small, vibrant nation-states that would come to define Iron Age civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean world. Although the specific historical circumstances remain elusive, the accumulating archaeological and textual evidence point to the existence of a powerful regional kingdom centered in the North Orontes Valley, the land of Palistin, or Wallenstein, which emerged in the aftermath of the Hittite Empire's collapse, ruled by a king named Taita, and a succession of rulers with Hittite names, and very possibly with direct ancestral links to the Hittite royal dynasty. Intriguingly, this early Iron Age polity also exhibits strong Aegean cultural ties, as we've seen from the pottery and other craft industries that I showed you, if not direct evidence for the presence of foreign settlers. Centered at Tel Tainat, the wealth of this hypothesized, and I have to emphasize that still, this is very speculation on my part, early Iron Age kingdom is reflected in the impressive buildings and standing monuments that still crown its citadel today. So in concluding here, I'd like to end with the rainbow shot, the proverbial, we're in pursuit of the proverbial pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Here on a rainy day at Tel Tainat, you can see in the low outline here in the horizon, we have many, many more things to investigate here. We hope many more discoveries to make. They may change a lot of the picture that I've tried to reconstruct here this afternoon. In that case, hopefully someday I might come back and update you. Until then, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll resume with Jeremy Johns just after 4 o'clock.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sheila Canby. I'm the curator in charge of the Islamic Art Department here at the Met. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our last speaker of the day, Jeremy Johns. We are, of course, going to take a great leap in time and also in space towards Sicily. So we're moving westward. But the idea of the transition and rulers in a time of transition, of course, remains the same. Now, Professor Jeremy Johns is a graduate of Oxford University, both undergraduate, and that is where he received his PhD, and where he wrote his PhD thesis on the Muslims of Norman Sicily. After teaching at the University of Newcastle, he returned to Oxford in 1990 and has been teaching there ever since. In 2004, he was appointed the first director of the Khalili Research Center for the Art and Material Culture of the Middle East. And then in 2006, he was made professor of the art and archaeology of the Islamic Mediterranean. His research interest really covers this transitional period, the relationship between Islam and Christianity in the medieval Mediterranean. And he has worked as an archaeologist, also looking at the transition from late antiquity to early Islam in the Levant. More recently, he's done a great deal of work in Sicily, particularly on the Cappella Palatina, and luckily for him, after 3 years in the trenches as the chair of the Faculty of Oriental Studies and the deputy chair of the Division of Humanities at the University of Oxford, he has been freed to do his research for a while. And so, ever productive, he's now just completed with collaborators a 4-volume study of the Cappella Palatina in Palermo, and he is also he's worked on the Arabic inscriptions there, as well as the Islamic painted ceilings. He's working also on a new critical edition of the Arabic documents of Norman Sicily, and publishing other fieldwork, outstanding fieldwork from Jordan, Herbert Faris, and Monreale in Sicily. He's finally working on a biographical study of the subject of his talk today, of George of Antioch. Now, George of Antioch, according to Professor Johns, spans the worlds of Byzantium, the Islamic world, and the Latin West at the time of the Crusades. He used art and architecture to communicate messages that transcend and, in a sense, link those 3 cultural spheres. So I would like to greet him, and he will be speaking on Emir of Emirs, George of Antioch, and the creation of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sheila, very much for those generous words of introduction. Unlike the other speakers that we've heard today, I'm very pleased to be here with the weather like this. The last time I was here, you were enjoying a heat wave at the end of March last year, and I got terrible allergies and then became sick for about 3 months, so I'm very grateful for a little snow. In the summer of 1151, an old man died in great pain caused by kidney stones in his home in the center of Palermo. His body was carried the few yards from his deathbed to his tomb and buried alongside the remains of his wife and his mother in the family mausoleum in the narthex, in the entrance to the church that he'd founded more than a dozen years before his death. Their graves were marked with epitaphs in Greek verse carved in marble near to a mosaic panel depicting the donor prostrate before the Virgin, who holds a scroll on which is inscribed her prayer to her son, who presides over the scene, entreating him to shield the supplicant donor and all his family from every adversity. Her prayer fell on the deaf ears of the late 16th century builders who extensively altered the original narthex and west end of the church, smashing the donors' tombs in the mausoleum and mixing the family's bones and the shattered fragments of their marble coffins and epitaphs beneath the new pavement of the Baroque church. The mosaic panel of the donor was detached and moved to a new position, causing it such damage that the body of the donor was completely destroyed, leaving only the original head and hands attached to this checkered sack with its stick-like arms. Today, his church is almost completely hidden from view behind this Baroque facade, and his church is most generally known neither by the name of its founder, nor even by the name of the Holy Virgin Mother of God, for whom, as we shall see, he felt such a particular devotion. But rather it's known by the name of Geoffrey of Martorana, the founder of an adjacent Benedictine monastery. And today, tourists and smart guests at Palermitan weddings hurry past the donor's portrait into the nave of that church, unconscious of his presence, ignorant of his name, and unaware that in his time he'd been one of the 4 or 5 most influential, most powerful, most feared and most hated men in the Islamic Mediterranean. Now, also in the narthex that the donor had built to be his tomb, he placed this second mosaic panel, commemorating his greatest achievement. Christ, holding in his left hand the rolled scroll which contains his mother's prayer on behalf of the donor, with his right hand places an open diadem on the head of a figure wearing Byzantine imperial dress, who, despite his slightly bowed head and hands extended in submission towards Christ, gazes directly out of the panel, engaging not with his heavenly overlord, but with his earthly subjects. And the mosaic inscription on either side of Christ's head is abbreviated to just 4 letters, standing for Jesus Christos, while the king's name is spelled out in full, Rogerius Rex, King Roger. In his classic book on the emperor in Byzantine art, André Grabar described the king's panel as a sort of official symbolic representation of the royalty through the grace of God of King Roger, under whom the donor, his subject, had built the church. Indeed, the verse epitaph of the donor describes that relationship between the human figures in these 2 mosaic panels. The donor is the king's light and joy, the precious jewel in his crown, he whose rank is Panipasebastos, he who is revered above all others, the commander of the army, the most splendid light of the world, the most venerable seed of the city of Antioch, the sweet delight of the West, the wonder of the world, the lamp that illuminates Christianity, the thunderbolt that has struck so many barbarian cities and like lightning consumed them in the fire of his strength, he who holds in one hand all the power to be found on land and on sea. He was George of Antioch. And this afternoon, in tracing George's career, I have 3 main aims. First, I'll argue that although George was born in Byzantine Antioch and belonged to the Greek Orthodox Church, he was less a citizen of the Byzantine world than of the Islamic Mediterranean, in which he was educated and trained in the exercise of power from behind the throne. And second, I'll show how at a crucial moment in the conception of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, George begins to experiment in his own building, in his own church, with many of the artistic media and many of the royal symbols that were to characterize the unique multicultural art and architecture of Norman Sicily. And third and finally, I'll attempt to persuade you that it was George who was principally responsible for the extraordinary decision to draw heavily upon Arabic and Islamic culture in the creation of the Norman monarchy, manipulating the image of his royal master so that he appeared less as a Norman king, less as a Byzantine Basileus, than as an Islamic sultan. One thing that I don't think I need to do this afternoon is to explain at any length why the period between the mid-11th and the mid-12th century was a time of transition in the central and eastern Mediterranean. On the one hand, the following sequence of maps helps to make the point, and on the other, by giving an outline of the life of George of Antioch, I must inevitably refer to the momentous changes at the heart of so many of which was George himself. In the mid-11th century, the invasion of the Seljuk Turks drove many thousands of Armenian refugees into the plains drained by the river Sajur, a tributary of the Euphrates to the northwest of Aleppo, and thence they spread westwards into the plain of the Orontes and the southern coast of Asia Minor, so that this region is frequently called Lesser or Cilician Armenia. And among the refugees were the noble family of Pahlavuni, and you must not forget the Pahlavuni. Vasak Pahlavuni, you must particularly remember the Pahlavuni. Vasak Pahlavuni became Duke of Antioch and held that precarious outpost of Byzantium in the grim years after the Byzantine army was defeated by the Turks at Manzikert on the 26th of August, 1071, until Vasak died in 1078. And just 6 years later, on the 17th of December, 1084, Antioch surrendered to Suleiman, the grandson of Seljuk, and Anatolia was temporarily lost to Byzantium. Now, back in the 7th century, the Sasanian Shahanshah, the King of Kings, had awarded an Armenian prince a lesser Greek title that was a kalp, that was modeled upon his own style. So he was called Hoakonton Ankarton, the Prince of Princes. And that style had stuck and became so popular amongst the Armenian nobility that by the 10th century it was widely used even amongst lesser Armenian nobles and public officials. The fact that much later in Sicily, George of Antioch was to adopt the same title on his personal seal, which is rather more legible in this drawing, raises the possibility that George himself was an Armenian, a hypothesis which is strengthened by the fact that his father, Michael, served under the Armenian Duke of Antioch, Vasak Pahlavuni, and also by the fact that in 1135 to 37, when George was vizier to King Roger of Sicily, he had a remarkable correspondence and relationship with Vahram, the Armenian vizier of the ruling caliph of Fatimid Egypt, Vahram, who was a nephew of Duke Vasak, and thus another Pahlavuni, whom you must not forget. Now, at this point, I have to come clean about an embarrassing episode of my past, not least because it reveals that Islamicists too have their chronological problems, although nothing like those of Egyptologists or archaeologists of the ancient Near East. Now, 10 years ago, when I translated into English the short biography of George of Antioch, preserved by the 13th century polymath Al-Makrizi, I gave the version that you can see on the screen of the crucial passage which gives us George's date of birth. Now, we know from George's epitaph that he certainly died in the year 1151, and I therefore concluded that he must have been born 90 years before, in 1061. But 5 years after I published that, Altalgisa de Simone, the eminent Palermitan Arabist who first discovered George's biography, lost amongst Al-Makrizi's logorrheic output, Adalgisa pointed out that the Arabic must contain an error that's remarkably common amongst scribes and editors of Arabic manuscripts. When written with diacritic points, as you see here, the diacritic points that distinguish one letter from another in Arabic, the words 90 and 70 look similar at first glance, but at a second glance can be readily distinguished. But when written without the diacritic points on the opening letters, as in this slide, the two words are easily confused, even in printed text, as we see here, let alone in scribal scrawl. Now, in the 12th century, when the mean adult male life expectancy was between 30 and 40, few men lived to be 70, and almost none reached the age of 90. So it's therefore a priori likely that George died at the age of 70 and not at 90, and that he was therefore born in 1081, not 1061. And confirmations to be found in the epitaph of George's mother, Theodola, where the date of her death is given as the 31st of January, 1140, only 11 years before her son. Now, while she could have given birth to George when she was as young as 12 or 13 years old, that would mean that she was well into her 90s when she died. Al-Makrizi's Life of George also tells us that he had a younger brother called Simon, who was murdered before he reached puberty, sometime shortly before the year 1108. So Simon must have been born in about 1095, meaning that if George had been born in 1061, his mother would have been bearing children for some 35 years, between the ages of 12 and 47. Now, that is biologically just about possible, but you appreciate how the improbabilities are mounting up. So in all likelihood, George was born in 1081, and he died at the age of 70 in the summer of 1151. Now, this conclusion is highly significant, because it means that it wasn't George, as I once thought, but his father, Michael, who was a leading administrator in Byzantine Syria, where, according to the Arabic Life of George and other Arabic histories that are clearly drawn from the same bundle of sources, in Syria, where George's family, Michael's family, had become expert in financial administration and had become fluent in Arabic. And what's more, the fact that George is born in 1081 means that he was still a boy of only 6 or 7 years when his family left what remained of Byzantine Syria and moved to a most unexpected destination. The Arabic Life of George reports that while his family was in Byzantine service somewhere in Syria, and I'm presuming that that must mean in Cilician Armenia here, while they were in service there, an accusation was brought against them, and they were called to Constantinople by the Emperor Alexius Komnenos to answer the charge. I quote, "The emperor ordered them, men, women, and children, to be brought before him. They were assembled in a boat and set off in number of 40. But the fleet of the Sultan Tamim, the lord of the lands of the west, intercepted them, and they were taken and brought to Almathia in the land of Africa." Now, it simply beggars belief that a fleet from modern Tunisia just happened to be cruising in the Dodecanese, 1,500 kilometers from home, and just happened to intercept the ship carrying the household of one of the leading Byzantine administrators of Syria, an expert in financial administration and a fluent Arabic speaker. I think it's clear that Michael had judged it opportune to leave Byzantine service before the emperor punished him and his family for whatever crime they were alleged to have committed, and arranged to defect to a Muslim court that lay well beyond the reach of the Byzantine fleet, the court of Tamim, the Zirid, the Berber Sultan of North Africa. Now, in seeking service in an Islamic court, Michael was following the path of many Armenian exiles in the 11th and 12th century. In particular, the Fatimid caliphs of Cairo employed a succession of Armenians as their viziers and chief ministers from the 1070s until the 1130s. The Zirid Sultan Tamim, therefore, who was nominally the subject of the Fatimid Caliph of Cairo, seems to have followed the example of his Fatimid master and had decided to fill the highest offices of his court with Armenian ministers. And it was thus in Al-Mahdiya in modern Tunisia that George arrived in 1088, when he was 6 or 7 years old. He was to remain at the Zirid court for the next 20 years, so that the whole of the formative period of his life was spent in service to a Muslim ruler. When George and his family arrived in Al-Mahdiya, the Zirid realm was in crisis. Earlier in the century, Arab tribes had migrated westwards from their traditional grazing grounds in Upper Egypt and had profoundly disrupted the agricultural basis of the Zirid economy. And as if that were not bad enough, the emergent maritime city-states of peninsular Italy, Genova, Pisa, Naples, and Amalfi, began to attack Zirid shipping. In 1087, the year before George arrived in Al-Mahdiya, the city was sacked by a joint force from Genova and Pisa, which sailed under the papal banner. Moreover, the participants had been granted a type of indulgence, partial remission of their sins by Pope Victor III. So the Christian holy war against Islam, which we now know by the name of the Crusades, had begun. And the Mediterranean, which had been relatively peaceful and stable, a sort of Muslim lake for some 300 years since the 8th century, now again became a theatre of war. The conquest of Muslim Sicily by the Normans was completed in 1092. Antioch fell to the Crusaders in 1098, swiftly followed by Jerusalem in 1099, and then the establishment of a series of Crusader principalities in the Levant. And all the while in the far west, the Islamic frontier in the Spanish peninsula was pushed steadily southwards by Christian forces. The Mediterranean was undergoing the greatest and most violent time of transition since the Arab conquests. And it was to this medieval clash of civilizations that the Norman Kingdom of Sicily and George of Antioch, one of its principal creators, was to make a unique contribution. Now, we know very little about George's childhood and youth in Al-Mahdiya, and it's not until after the year 1100, when he would have been in his early 20s, that he first appears as governor of the coastal city of Susa, the main port for shipping with Sicily, and then as head of the whole financial administration of the Zirid Sultanate. Our sources, their prurient interest is focused not on George, but on his younger brother, Simon, who we're told was kept close by the Sultan Tamim within the palace. Simon was employed by the Sultan to spy upon members of the royal family, including Yahya, his eldest son and heir. And we're told that when Simon reported something that Yahya had said to Tamim, Yahya became so enraged that he had Simon strangled one night. And years later in Sicily, George was to name one of his own sons after his murdered brother. So it's not surprising that when Tamim died on the 29th of February 1108, and the murderous Yahya succeeded his father, George and the surviving members of his family should have sought to defect again to another foreign court. In February 1108, Roger II of Sicily was a child of 12 years, and his country was governed on his behalf by his mother, the Regent Adelaide, and her chief minister, Christodoulos, who was one of a small elite of Arabic-speaking Greek Christians who dominated the administration of the county of Sicily and Calabria until the foundation of the kingdom in 1130. Christodoulos was chief minister under Roger I, his widow, the Regent Adelaide, and their son, the young Roger II, from 1107 at the latest until 1126. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius Komnenos courted Christodoulos and awarded him the rank of protonobilissimos in 1109, and the Arabic sources refer to him respectfully as Roger's vizier and give him the honorific title of sultan. One of the cornerstones of Christodoulos' international policy was to establish ever closer links between Norman Sicily and Zirid Africa, not least because the destruction of the Zirid state agricultural base had created a demand for Sicilian wheat, so great that Sicily's ruler was to earn the Arabic title Abu Tilis, which you can translate loosely as old wheat sack. And the Sicilian ruler also earned the reputation for not caring about anything that might interrupt this lucrative trade in Sicilian wheat to Zirid Africa. As governor of the port of Susa, and then as head of the Zirid fiscal administration, George of Antioch would have been keenly aware of Norman Sicily, not least of the flow of Sicilian grain into Africa in return for Zirid gold going out to Sicily. And so on Yahya's succession, George wrote to Christodoulos offering his services and those of his family to the Sicilian vizier. As a defector, George and his family had a great deal to offer. They had trained in Byzantine service in Antioch and Syria, where they'd learned both fiscal administration and Arabic. George himself had used these skills to rise rapidly to the top of the Zirid administration, and his linguistic ability, his administrative expertise, his intimate knowledge of the politics and organization of Zirid Africa, including, of course, the country's topography and its coastal defenses, his family's contacts with the influential Armenian communities scattered throughout the courts of the Eastern Mediterranean, and with the chancelleries and ambassadors of other Islamic courts, and the fact that he would bring with him his family and his household, including other trained administrators and officials, all these would have made George most attractive as a prospect to Christodoulos. Christodoulos therefore dispatched a ship to Al-Mahdiya, and while the Muslims of the city were at Friday prayers, George and all his family disguised themselves as sailors, slipped down to the harbour, and were underway before they were missed. Unwittingly, Christodoulos had signed his own death warrant. On arriving in Sicily, George was treated with initial caution. By 1114, 6 years after his arrival, he was still only the district governor of Iato in the mountains to the south of Palermo, where Roger maintained a notorious political prison. But very soon thereafter, in or about 1115, Christodoulos summoned George to court and sent him on a series of embassies to the capital of the Fatimid caliphs of Egypt, in Cairo. Arabic sources report that his missions were successful, and some 20 years later, a long letter, ostensibly from the Fatimid Caliph al-Hafiz to King Roger, much of which is devoted to al-Hafiz's Armenian vizier, Bahram Pahlavuni. So now you know why you were not to forget the Pahlavuni. This letter praises George extravagantly, grants him and his ships exemption from all customs, dues and taxes in the ports of Alexandria and Fustat, that is the river port of Cairo on the Nile. And from the time of George's first embassy in about 1115, relations between Palermo and Cairo become increasingly close and remained close until very shortly after George's death in 1151. And it was from the Fatimid Chancery, for example, that George of Antioch imported the scribes, scripts, and diplomatic forms, and the bureaucratic practices and structures that he used to rebuild the Arabic administration of Norman Sicily between 1130 and 1145. And it was from Fatimid Cairo that many of the Muslim artists, woodcarvers, carpenters, painters, textile workers, who were employed in developing the Islamic facet of the art and architecture of the Norman Kingdom, originally came. Now, at exactly the time that relations between Norman Sicily and the Fatimids of Cairo improved, so did relations with the Zirids of Africa, which had been cordial since 1075, take a rapid turn for the worst. In 1117, the Sicilians supported an Arab lord in rebellion against the Zirid Sultan, who reacted by seeking an alliance with the Almoravids of Morocco, who in 1122 dispatched a fleet that raided and razed the town of Nicotera in Calabria. In July 1123, a powerful Sicilian fleet commanded by Christodulus, with George of Antioch in second command, was launched against the Zirid capital. But the expedition ended in disaster. Of the great fleet of 300 ships, which had reportedly set sail with 30,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, only 100 vessels and 2 horses are said to have returned to Sicily. It's tempting to assume that Christodulus never recovered from the disastrous defeat of 1123, and that this was the cause of his downfall. But there's no escaping the fact that the two men, Christodulus and George, appear side by side in Roger's entourage in documents from the years 1124 and 1125. In these, however, George appears for the first time with the rank of emir, the same rank as his patron Christodulus, whose name, however, in the documents precedes that of his protege. Christodulus appears for the last time alongside George in a document of December 1125, and until very recently, it was assumed that towards the end of his career, Christodulus must have associated George in his authority in preparation for his retirement from public life. But the Arabic life of George of Antioch, rediscovered by Adalgisa de Simone, which can be shown to be very substantially based upon the account of a contemporary Zirid historian, tells a very different story. After relating how Christodulus had welcomed George and his family at Palermo, how he had employed them within his administration, and how he'd many times dispatched George as ambassador to Cairo, the story continues in the following words. But George did not cease to calumniate the Lord Christodulus until Roger seized Christodulus and locked him in an iron cage and executed him. Roger offered the vizierate to Abu ad-Daw, the head of his Arabic chancery, but he was a man of letters and would not accept the position. So Roger had to appoint George as his vizier. There's only this bald statement of George's treachery towards his old patron, and we're told nothing of the circumstances surrounding Christodulus's fall. But the fact of his fall, for the first time, makes sense of a number of previously unsolved mysteries, including Christodulus' sudden disappearance, the reversion of his personal property into Roger's hands, the seclusion of his children in religious houses in remote Calabria, and the simultaneous fall from Roger's favour of some of Christodulus' leading protégés. That George of Antioch was not Roger's first choice to succeed Christodulus, and that he was appointed vizier only when Abu ad-Dawr prudently declined to come between George and that office, suggests that the Zirid historian believed that Roger may initially have had reservations about his new vizier. And it's curious that George appears in no authentic document between December 1125, when Christodulus made his last disappearance, and February 1132, nearly 7 years later. But although it's tempting to follow the lead of the Arabic source and to suggest that Roger was slow to permit George to use the corpse of Christodulus to step up to power, there are clear indications that these were 6 years during which George was extremely busy. First, when he next appears in 1132, it's clear that George had consolidated his position at court. He no longer used merely the title of emir that Christodulus had borne, and which George himself had adopted on this seal that he used early in his career. He was now the unrivaled chief minister, whom in March 1132 King Roger describes as the emir of emirs, he who presides over my whole kingdom, words which George himself had obviously put into the king's mouth. But the second, and undoubtedly the most time-consuming of George's activities between 1125 and 1132, had been the preparations for the coronation of Roger on Christmas Day 1130. And because that coronation was less a culmination than a new beginning, the huge and complicated business of manufacturing a royal persona, a royal image for the new king. In the donor panel, above George's head, are the words, "Petition of thy servant George, the emir," written in a formula that's designed to suggest direct speech, as if George is addressing these words directly to the Virgin. And in her left hand, as we've seen, she holds not George's petition, but her prayer to her son. O child, shield from adversity George, the first of all archons, who has built me this house from the foundations, and also all his family, grant him absolution from his sins. For thou, O Word, as the only God, have the power. As the late Ernst Kitzinger, upon whose fundamental studies of George's church I have relied so heavily, as Ernst Kitzinger observed, the two panels, and I'm quoting, viewed together, show a circular flow and counterflow of authority involving a strictly hierarchic order. Power flows from Christ to the king, to George, his minister, and George then petitions the Virgin, who addresses Christ, who as the only God has the power. Now, Kitzinger believed that these panels dated from shortly before 1150, towards the ends of the lives of both George, who died in 1151, and Roger, who followed him in 1154. And thus, in a sense, Kitzinger believed that these panels summed up their joint achievement in creating the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. But in 2007, the Italian Byzantinist Augusta Longo argued persuasively that George's church of Santa Maria dell'Ammiraglio and these two mosaic panels within it must have been completed before 1140 and therefore date from the 1130s, soon after Roger's coronation on Christmas Day 1130. And if she's correct, and I'm almost completely convinced that she is, then what is symbolized in these panels is not so much a summation of the first 20 years of the Sicilian kingdom, so much as a statement of George's aspirations as to what the kingdom might become. That this extraordinarily potent image of royal power comes not from one of the king's own buildings, but from the personal foundation of his minister, George of Antioch, serves to focus our attention upon George's role in the creation of the Norman kingdom. And it even causes us to ask whether, in reality, the source of Roger's power may not have been, in a sense, his minister, George of Antioch. Now, contemporary sources in Arabic, in Greek, and in Latin suggest that this is very likely to have been the case. Writing at about this time, in 1136, Alexander of Tolese, a Latin writer, introduces George into his biography of King Roger as, I quote, the greatest emir, the man who was the king's closest confidant and who was most frequently entrusted with his worldly affairs. The author of a long Greek poem addressed to George by an anonymous man whom George had exiled to the island of Gozo, compares the relationship between George and King Roger to that between John the Baptist and Christ. And the Arabic life of George goes into great detail. I quote, George amassed the revenues and organized the foundations of the kingdom. He veiled King Roger from his subjects and arranged for him to dress in clothes like the Muslims and not to ride out, nor to show himself in public except on holidays. When he would process, preceded by horses adorned with saddles of gold and silver, and with caparisons studded with gemstones, and by domed litters and gilded banners, with a parasol above him and the crown upon his head. George was entitled Exalted Master, Pleasing to God, Glory of the Victorious King, Pride of Majesty, Rule of Leadership, Leader of Armies, Honor of Ministers, Emir of Emirs. He acquainted Roger with the biographies of kings and ordered one of his secretaries, called the Snake, and obviously there's something going on there that we don't know about, to compile a biography of Roger. Roger's state grew under George's management, and thus the island flourished in a most splendid way. And there's good material evidence to corroborate the claims made by these literary sources. From 1126 until his death in 1151, George was the head of the entire administration of the kingdom, and it was either George himself or perhaps more probably his personal Greek scribe who actually wrote what was long thought to be the autograph signature of King Roger, which appears at the foot of all of his documents. Certainly on George's death, that signature suddenly begins to be written by a different hand. It was George who was the architect of the trilingual royal chancery, which I'm illustrating here with a detail from a late 12th century manuscript by Peter of Eboli, showing the Greek, the Saracen, that is the Arabic, and the Latin notaries at work within the chancery, presided over by the chancellor, who for reasons we won't go into is called Bigamus, but his costume here may, I think, possibly reflect the sort of costume that George himself would have worn as business dress. On the international stage, George was the strategist behind the Norman conquest of the African coast in the years 1134 to 48, and he often took personal command of the Sicilian forces, as he had first done with Christodolos in the disastrous expedition of 1123. George also commanded the expedition against Amalfi in 1131 and violently suppressed the rebellion in Bari in 1132. He led the two naval campaigns against Pisa in 1134 and 35 and the war against Byzantium in 1149, when he sailed a fleet of 40 ships past the walls of Constantinople into the Bosphorus to pillage the Asian shore. And George also cultivated the arts of diplomacy, as we've seen, and carefully nurtured his contacts in the Armenian diaspora to his royal master's advantage, both in Cairo and indeed in Crusader Antioch. But the most copious and persuasive evidence for George's crucial formative role in the creation of the Sicilian kingdom comes from his church. If Augusta Concholunga is correct in dating Santa Maria dell'Ammiraglio to the 1130s, then it's almost certainly earlier than the great royal foundations of Roger's reign, both Cefalù and the Cappella Palatina. And that would mean that George's church is the first of the churches of Norman Sicily to adopt many of the architectural and decorative features that subsequently come to characterize the group as a whole. Architecture that combines local traditions with innovations imported from both Byzantium and, particularly important, Fatimid Egypt. A decorative mosaic program set by artists imported from Byzantium. Cosmotesque pavements that make extravagant use of porphyry, spolia, of course, from the Roman world. Monumental epigraphy in both Greek and Arabic, and here I'm drawing your attention to the poorly preserved, still undeciphered Greek monumental inscription on the exterior of the church. Now, I could go on to list other innovations that first appear in George's church: wooden doors carved in the Fatimid style, plaster window grills with Arabic inscriptions, inlaid ablak, that is black and white decoration in stonework. But I want to concentrate instead upon just three aspects of the decoration, which will show the fluency with which George used visual language to convey a range of messages, from the public to the intensely personal and even private. Now, we've already seen how George used this pair of panels to express both his vision for the hierocratic Sicilian monarchy, in which no earthly power, neither pope nor emperor, intervenes between the king and the god who gives him royal authority, and at the same time that explains George's own personal relationship with the Virgin and the relationship between George and his royal master. Now, the mosaic decoration of the dome of George's church also develops a series of ideas about hierocratic kingship. In the apex of the dome comes the figure of Christ Pantocrator, the all-ruler, seated on his throne, the first appearance in the art of Norman Sicily of the image that was to dominate all of the later royal churches, the Cappella Palatina, Cefalù, and Monreale. And in George's church, as in these three royal churches, the text that accompanies the Pantocrator, here in the band encircling the figure, there in the open gospel book in Christ's hand. The text is from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 12, in which Christ speaks of himself as the light of the world. And remember that George is given a very similar title in his own Greek epitaph. These images and their inscriptions introduce the theme of divine light, which in the Cappella Palatina, in Roger's royal chapel, as we shall see in a minute, illuminates the whole of a royal axis connecting the royal throne in the west end of the nave with the image of the Pantocrator in the eastern apse, a far more elaborate development of an idea that's already present in the Pantocrator of George's church. Moreover, as Concholongo has now demonstrated, the chorus of prophets, that's these 8 prophets around the drum of the dome here in George's church, can be shown to have directly inspired the chorus of prophets here in the drum of the dome in the Cappella Palatina. But while it's clear that many of the ideas about the nature of the new king's royal authority were first imagined in George's church before they were transferred to later royal foundations, George also manipulated images to express his own personal devotion to the Virgin. And this can be seen not just in the donor panel. The traditional Byzantine system of church decoration is focused on the life of Christ, told in images following the so-called feast cycle from the Annunciation and the Nativity through the life of Christ to the crucifixion and the resurrection. But in George's church, there are none of the Christological scenes from the traditional feast cycle except those relating to the Virgin. No crucifixion, no resurrection, none of the other scenes illustrating Christ's mission, but only the Annunciation, the Nativity, the presentation in the temple, and the Dormition of the Virgin. So that the feast cycle in George's church culminates with the death and resurrection not of Christ, but of the Virgin, an extraordinary statement of George's personal devotion to the Mother of God. But the decoration of the dome also conceals a still more personal, even secret statement of George's personal devotion. The decoration of the Pantocrator dome in George's church is inspired by a rare variation of the standard Byzantine scheme, now attested in only one other standing monument at Megara in Attica, which dates from about 1170, and I only have this old black and white photograph on it. Clearly, George's church and the Megara church were both influenced by the same common model. The Pantocrator is shown not as a bust, but a full enthroned figure, and the surrounding angels are not standing, but bowed in worship. And it's on those angels that we must focus. Here at Megara, we see them in a very graceful pose, clearly painted by an artist who was well practiced in their depiction. But here in the Capella Palatina, and here in George's church, their pose is at best extremely awkward, wholly lacking in the grace that we see here at Megara. That this is not mere artistic incompetence, but the result of a deliberate choice made by the patron, is revealed by a wholly unique feature in the dome of George's church. Above the heads of the prophets here, and below the feet of the angels, so here is an Arabic text painted on wooden panels. And I apologize for this atrocious image, which incidentally illustrates how very difficult it is to read and to photograph this inscription. The inscription opens with a Greek monogram and then continues with two passages from the Greek liturgy translated into Arabic. The first has the Sanctus from Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3, and is followed by the Hosanna from Matthew chapter 2, verse 19. The second is part of the so-called morning hymn from the great doxology. In other words, George has provided the text of the hymn of praise that the worshipping angels sing to the Pantocrator. And he's made sure that they sing this not in Greek, but in the language in which he himself worshipped his God, in Arabic. Now, the use of Arabic epigraphy in George's church, alongside Byzantine mosaics, is one of the earliest experiments in the deliberate juxtaposition of elements drawn from Arabic Islamic and from Greek Christian culture in the royal art of Norman Sicily, an experiment that reaches its culmination in the Capella Palatina. At the same time that he was building his church, George was presiding over the construction of the trilingual chancery, as we've already seen. And we see this in the foundation document, the endowment document for George's church, which is in Greek with Arabic details, and at the top of the document here, what purports to be the autograph Arabic signature of King Roger. Obviously written not by the king, who was functionally illiterate in all three administrative languages of the kingdom, but by a professional scribe. In conclusion, I want to move very, very quickly to the Capella Palatina. Here we're looking east towards the sanctuary and the chapel proper. And here is a view looking west from that sanctuary towards the throne platform in the middle of the west wall. As you can see here, the sanctuary and the walls of the hall are coated with mosaics representing Christian scenes. But the royal hall, what we now think of as the nave and the two side aisles, are covered by 3 wooden ceilings painted by Muslim artists imported to Sicily from Fatimid Egypt. The principal theme of the painted ceilings is the celebration of the life of the king and the pleasures of his court, so that the ruler is repeatedly depicted with attendants, surrounded by his cup companions or nudama, and with musicians, dancing girls, and so forth. Now, this royal program was bought ready-made, off the peg, from the Muslim artists. But at a number of carefully selected locations within the ceiling, so as to collaborate with the mosaics in conveying a common message, new elements were added to the paintings that derive from Byzantine and indeed from Latin, from Romanesque art. This is most evident in this axis that runs through the ceiling, and I just want to take you very, very quickly through it. It's going here from the throne platform through the figure of Christ in Majesty and then carrying on here in the sanctuary. So there you see it linking the earthly ruler with the heavenly ruler above, running through the mosaics, through other biblical rulers, Solomon, who stands above these 2 spiral columns representing the pillars of the temple, Jachin and Boaz. Beneath a representation, or the columns hold up this arch, on which there is a representation of the temple, of the presentation of Christ, of the temple. Then the axis continues through the Christ Pantocrator, surrounded by this text that actually describes in words what we see on the west wall, so the heavenly king with the earthly king as his footstool. The axis goes through the Pantocrator, through another ancient king, King David, and culminates in the Pantocrator in the Eastern Alps. The ceiling also plays a part in this axis, and we can see that in the painting here in the middle of the ceiling in the West End, which groups together a series of images of royal apotheosis. There is a ascent of Alexander, very badly repainted in the 16th century and badly restored in the 20th and 21st century. The original image would have looked, I think, like one of these 2. We have also a pair of winged lions, upwardly mobile lions, a eagle, who was very probably a double-headed eagle on this Almoravid parallel, and 2 celestial chariots. Celestial chariots which continue the theme of royal apotheosis and that is set up by this juxtaposition between the earthly ruler and the heavenly ruler, and also introduce the new theme of heavenly light, which refers to the mosaics in the eastern end, where the inscription above the arch of the crossing, incorporated into the Annunciation, begins, "May the light, the life, and the way fill you, O Virgin Mary," and where at the eastern end of the axis, the Pantocrator in the Eastern Alps displays a gospel book on which is transcribed in Greek and Latin, John 8:12, "I am the light of the world." Now, these images of royal apotheosis contain both images that were standard in the Islamic royal program, the upwardly mobile lions and the eagle, and images that were clearly introduced to the ceiling from Christian art, including the ascent of Alexander and these 2 celestial chariots. This deliberate juxtaposition of images drawn from different cultures, and in particular the use of elements drawn from Arabic and Islamic culture to enhance the royal image, is what gives its unique character to the art of Norman Sicily. And as we've seen, It first appears in the Church of George of Antioch and in the offices of the monarchy, the trilingual chancery, the mint, and the wardrobe, these offices that were established under George's rule as Roger's chief minister. There can be little doubt, I believe, that George's long training in the Islamic Mediterranean, in the court of the Zirid ruler Tamim, as an ambassador to the Fatimid court of Cairo, best accounts for the use of these elements in Norman Sicily. George's life coincided with the extraordinary intensification of war between Christianity and Islam in the Mediterranean. As a child in Byzantine Syria, he'd experienced conquest by the Muslim Turks. In Zirid Africa, he'd been a Christian administrator governing a large Muslim people. In Norman Sicily, he became the chief architect of a new Christian monarchy that ruled over subjects of whom the majority were Muslim. Although he himself was a fluent Arabic speaker, he seems to have understood that in Sicily the claims for the new monarchy were best expressed not in words but in a visual language that was intended to overcome linguistic borders and to have deliberately set out to create a material and visual culture for the new monarchy that expressed its claims in visual symbols that all could understand, irrespective of their language and religion. Now, in doing so, I have no doubt George's motives were purely political and utilitarian, and not motivated by any belief in the intrinsic worth of Islamic civilization or religion. And just a few years after his death, the experiment failed, as Norman Sicily was torn apart by religious wars. But for a few brief years, the art and architecture of Norman Sicily maintained the aspiration that in an age of transition, in the age of the Crusades, multicultural harmony could be achieved, at least in art and architecture. Thank you very much.